This one novice podcaster mistake is making your prep take way too long, and it's also screwing up the cadence of your guest interviews. Welcome to B2B On Air. I'm your host, Joseph Lewin, and in today's episode, we're going to talk about how asking too many questions is making your episodes much harder to prepare for and significantly worse. When I first start working to launch a podcast, the question about what questions should I ask comes up all the time. And the default thing that I see people do is they prep 15 or 20 questions for a podcast guest interview. And that is just way too many. And this is even more pronounced when I come in after somebody has started a podcast and I see how many questions they're prepping. It's just too much. You can't get through that many questions. And what ends up happening is that you're not able to actually shift on the fly. You're going to spend way more time looking down at your notes, looking down at your questions, trying to fit in everything you asked rather than letting the conversation flow. So how many podcast questions should you be asking in your guest interviews? In a B2B podcast, I recommend having 3 to 5 questions prepared and then be ready to ask really good follow-up questions. And that's where you're able to fill more time, but you're also able to dig deeper into different things that are interesting that come up that you might not have been able to prepare for to begin with anyway. If you have more questions than that, what ends up happening is you're just constantly looking down at your notes and trying to fit in all this stuff that you spent preparing ahead of time rather than really engaging well with the guest. So 3 questions can get you through a 15 to 25 minute interview pretty well. Now you might run into a situation every once in a while where you ask a question and somebody gives you a one-line response. And so you need to get good at digging in and asking good follow-up questions that dig deeper on the first question that you asked. But that's not something you have to necessarily prepare ahead of time. If you really want to, you could have 3 questions for a 15 to 20 minute interview and then maybe have 1 or 2 potential follow-ups that you're ready with ahead of time if you really want to prepare. Maybe when you're first starting out, that's a good idea. But the longer that you do this, the better you're going to get at asking these follow-up questions on the fly. The only time I would really encourage you to prep follow-up questions is if in your research that you're doing, you find a stat or something interesting that kind of builds the case for what you know your guest is going to talk about. So say that you're interviewing somebody about marketing campaigns and you ask them about their strategy for how to drive more conversions through paid ads. Maybe you've seen them on a podcast or you saw a LinkedIn post or something like that where they went into specific stats on a specific campaign. So then you might ask that as a follow-up and you would want to jot down some notes on that. But otherwise, you don't necessarily need a lot of follow-ups. We'll cover that in a future podcast interview. If your interview is going to be 25 to 45 minutes, you can do that with 5 questions. And if you keep it tight to that 5 questions, it gives you a lot more room to let the conversation go where it feels natural. It's going to feel much less canned. And I've found in podcast interviews, the more that the host is conversational and kind of adds some back and forth banter versus just asking straight questions and almost reading them like a script, it actually gives you as the podcast host a lot more credibility. You're kind of seen much more as a peer versus a journalist who's interviewing this person. It's a peer-to-peer conversation and it helps elevate your credibility as the host. So one more note on the questions and how 3 to 5 questions can be enough. And that's your question set is really an outline for your show. So you want to make sure that those questions move through some kind of a story arc or they have a clear beginning, middle, and end. And if you follow a structure that gives you that clear beginning, middle, and end, the guest is able to follow through with that. And then your audience is able to follow along with what you're talking about. It keeps the episodes a lot more interesting. And then where having those outline questions helps is as you're asking these follow-ups, when you get to a lull in the conversation and you're starting to feel bored, then your audience is definitely feeling bored. So then you can easily go back to your 3 questions or 5 questions and go to the next one and move the conversation along. But if it's not a clear outline where it's moving through a purposeful structure, then it's really hard to continue the conversation moving along. It just feels like disjointed questions that don't necessarily kind of follow any sort of journey through the episode. In some upcoming episodes, we're going to cover what kinds of questions you should ask and how to ask good follow-up questions. And with that, thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll see you on the next episode.